die, Father. Is nothing left. Ever since I was a child, I had a feeling something is missing in me. I want to know why I'm here. Can any of us know that?
Become yourself. Then God and the devil don't matter.
I want to learn. I want to understand. Be careful. Can you find the force to enable these two quite opposite lives to live together in yourself? At any moment, the wolf can devour the lamb. And you must learn what it means to become responsible. This is an exact science. And that is why you are here.
From before known history to the unknown future, this is Release Radio. For the Seeker.
And knowing the what. One must strive to know.
Greetings, newcomers and regular listeners. I'm Henrik Palmgren, and we welcome you to another Red Ice Radio program. I hope you're comfy and doing well overall, all things considering, and that you're excited about listening to new extraordinary material that we, together with our guests, help to present to you for your consideration. Today we're talking with Danny Wilten, an analyst, alchemist, symbolist, and hermeticist, about his ebook Orion in the Vatican. There is a mystery associated with the Orion constellation found in cultures all over the world that dates back to ancient Egypt. Dan is going to talk about man's connection to the Orion Nebula and its association to the human body, the brain, and consciousness. We'll talk about the mystery of how the Orion Nebula has been subconsciously depicted by some of the greatest masters in religious art, including Michelangelo, Bernini, El Greco, and others. Yet the intimate knowledge of the Orion Nebula found mysteriously in these paintings precedes the discovery of the telescope and still would require technology that rivals some of our most powerful telescopes today. We'll point out what art pieces reveal important clues and how this possibly was achieved. All right, welcome, Danny. Nice to talk to you. Thank you for coming on, sharing some of your insights with us today. I'm really looking forward to it, so welcome.
Thank you, Henrik. I appreciate you having me on.
Very good. I'm fascinated with your book, with your material. I've been going through it in the last few days, and there is some really interesting material therein that we are going to talk about here today. So the main topic is really about the Orion Nebula and the connection to how this motif shows up in the Vatican, various churches around Europe, but the connections go further beyond that as well. Give us the background, Danny. When and where, how did you stumble over to some of the material that we're going to talk about today?
Sure. Well, if we look into our past, what we find is that across culture there is one thing that sticks out like a sore thumb, and that's the Orion constellation. And so when I started doing some research on the Mayan culture, I found that they talk about what's called the three hearthstones of creation. Those are actually represented as three stars in the Orion constellation. And those three stars are Rigel, Alnitak, and Siph. And they make almost a perfectly equilateral triangle in the lower part of the Orion constellation. And right in the center of that is what they called the fire and the hearth. And that's where they considered the area of creation, where the maize god would be resurrected. And the interesting thing about that is that the whole idea about the maize god and Orion constellation is also seen in the ancient Egyptians as well, in their culture, as we all know. And so I had been doing research on the Mayans, and it was just kind of by accident one day. One of the problems that we find is that when we read text a lot of times, that there's a lot of different interpretations. Words and language to be a very left brain function. And when we take a look at the ancients and their cultures, they looked at things very right-brained as well. They kind of used a balance. And I just happened to have an infrared copy of the Orion Nebula in front of me open on one of my computer screens. And on the other computer screen, I had been looking at cathedral art from various churches because, especially from the area of about 1500 to about 1750, I would say, the art was very rich with symbolism. There's symbolism all over the place. Not like what you see in churches today, but a lot of it had to do with the sun or the glory that you see. For example, a lot of people are familiar with St. Peter's Cathedral or St. Peter's Chair, and you see the glory with the holy dove in the center with light rays coming out from all around it. Well, I happen to have a picture of the Orion Nebula open on one of my screens, and on the other screen I happen to be looking at a church called Karlskirche, and it was built in 1737. And I was looking at the high altar in there, and I noticed that there was a striking similarity between the infrared version of the Orion Nebula and that high altar. The first thing that comes to mind, of course, is that you have to be able to allow right brain expression enough to say, okay, well, this is what I'm seeing, so I need to go ahead and investigate it more. If you're very left-brained, what normally happens is you fold everything that you get into what your current model is, and if it doesn't fit into the current model, then you usually just deny it. But I went ahead and went with it, and I said, well, this is very interesting because it's very extremely similar. In fact, it's so similar that there are about 5 or 6 points on there that we can say where the shapes match, they're in the same positions and everything. And so when you start running probability on stuff like that, you start getting astronomical numbers because, first of all, you would have to have the chances of actually finding these specific shapes in nature is very low probability to begin with. And then finding that they're all rotated with respect to each other properly, they're in the proper locations and so forth, you know you've got something there. So I decided to start doing some investigation on that. And as I went from cathedral to cathedral, I started finding in some of these very large ones, including the Mother Jesuit Church, the Church of the Jesuit, the Chair of St. Peter, and some of these other ones, going all the way back to about as early as 1500. Notice that they were emulating or copying the Orion Nebula. Sometimes it was in infrared, and that goes back all the way to the Church of St. Mary and their cathedral art. And then probably the most amazing one in these cathedrals is the fresco by Giovanni Battista Galli, and it is called Triumph for the Name of Jesus, where they actually show the whole Orion constellation, and they show the Barnard's Loop, which is the Orion's loop that it circles around like a Fibonacci spiral, and the center of it is where the Orion Nebula is, and they actually have that depicted on the vault of the ceiling of the church. And it's basically down to the smallest details, and I used sacred geometry to verify that. So it just kind of all expanded from there.
Wow, yeah, it's fascinating, really, really interesting stuff. So did you have on the top of your head how many churches you've looked at, primarily in Europe, I would guess then, and some of the. I want to run through some of the artists as well because we need to talk to. Where this comes from, the origins, how these artists, are they commissioned to do a certain painting and then, by orders from someone else who's giving them what to do or whatnot. And so basically the source to all of this, but we'll take one thing at a time, Danny.
Sure.
Do you know how many churches you've looked at approximately?
The number, probably not right off the top of my head, but I can start naming them. There's Karlskirche, Chair of St. Peter. There's St. Mary's Cathedral in France, Paris, France. There is Assemkirche, which has a painting of the Tetragrammaton. There's the Church of the Jesuit. And let's see, I've got some more here I can look at. But right off the top of my head, we've got, I guess, after the churches, it begins to get into the artists themselves.
Right, yeah.
And the artists themselves, there were very few of them that seem to paint these same patterns over and over again. One of them was Michelangelo. One of them was Giovanni Battista Galli. with his assistance of Bernini. Bernini did the Chair of St. Peter in the Vatican, and where he depicted the Orion Nebula as well. And then when he went over to, I believe that Michelangelo was going to do the Church of the Gesù, and then he actually died before he was going to be able to do that. But over there at the Church of the Gesù, where we have the Triumph of the Name of Jesus, which is the whole Orion constellation, Giovanni Battista Galli did that with assistance with Bernini as well. So Bernini, Michelangelo, and Giovanni Battista Galli, which he was nicknamed, or a shorter version of his name is called Baxicchio, and very popular. He has several pieces of art, by the way, that show the Orion Nebula. And then there was also another one. His name was El Greco, which a lot of people are maybe familiar with. And he had some very interesting depictions of the Nile and the Nile Delta and its relationship to the nervous system. And that's kind of where I expanded from there when I went to Egypt, and to look at this Orion, look for symbol or areas that might give me some clues to Orion, obviously. Egypt was the place to go, and that's where I expanded from there after the cathedrals.
Well, exactly, and so if we backtrack a little bit to kind of go back in time, because we want to find the origins of this, I think we have to start pointing at a link, obviously, between the Roman Catholic Church, their predecessors, and potentially then going all the way back to Egypt, because this stuff comes from somewhere. So what findings did you make about this with the Egyptian connection? And then later maybe we can talk about if you believe that there is a transition from an older tradition basically into the Vatican, Danny.
Right. So when I started looking into the cathedrals and I had verified I had seen the Orion Nebula seem to be the focus, I started to look at some of the paintings. One of the major paintings I found was the one by Michelangelo called The Creation of Adam. And that particular painting, neurologists agree that what he painted was a brain. You can actually even see God sticking his arm out to touch Adam. If they don't actually touch fingers, it's almost like a synapse in a brain, showing that kind of a depiction.
Right.
Well, it was at that point when I found that he had painted the Orion Nebula. And by the way, the details and the matching ability of what he did is absolutely amazing. In fact, it's probably one of the most incredible things I have to show people that can really see stuff. You can really see that he has painted the Orion Nebula down to, and what I normally do for people is I'll divide something up into grids, and I'll say, okay, here is A4 versus A4, or B6 versus B6, and I show them, look, this is the same thing. And so he painted the Orion Nebula, and it was at that point when I realized that there was this tie to a human body, the man cosmos, as the ancient Egyptians called it. They called it the anthropocosm. They understood that the universe was just different scales of man, whether it be very large or whether it be very small, and that's the way their whole temples were designed.
Yeah.
And it was John Anthony West in his series called Magical Egypt. Are you familiar with that?
Oh, for sure, definitely. We've had John Anthony with us, and we've talked about the series before as well. Excellent series, by the way.
Oh, yeah, excellent series. And he goes into the work of R.A. Schwaller de Lubix. And R.A. Schwaller de Lubix studied the Temple of Man in Luxor for a long time, and it was from there that I started digging into his work and realized the way these ancient Egyptians thought. And so I realized that there was this connection between the human body and the Orion Nebula. And so when I went to ancient Egypt, one of the major patterns I kept finding over and over in these cathedrals was when I eventually started digging into the details of it, it wasn't just the Orion Nebula itself. It was actually the very center area of the Orion Nebula, the very bright spot called the trapezium. And if you ever look at a full-color visual of the Orion Nebula, what you'll see is in the very center of it, you'll see a bright yellow triangle, and that's called the trapezium, and that's what pretty much lights up the whole area of the Orion Nebula. Now, the Orion Nebula has a very mysterious past, because before 1611, when they invented telescopes, there was no account of the Orion Nebula. And even when they did have telescopes around 1611, Galileo and all these major guys missed it. And beyond that, they lost the records for like 50 to 100 years before anybody picked it up again. However, before 1611, the Mayans knew about it, and they knew about it all the way back to El Mirador, the Triadic Pyramids, where they depicted the three hearthstones, and the Orion Nebula being the very center. So they knew about it, but yet mysteriously, the Vatican was pretty much the primary guys funding all of the, the astronomy and the Jesuits and stuff like that. In fact, it wasn't until Cysatus of Lucerne in around 1618 he made a mention of it, but all these records got lost after a while. So there's a really interesting story there about how the Mayans knew about it, and how the Europeans, even though they discovered it around 1611, the records got lost for a long time. And interestingly, the story of the Mayans and the three hearthstones is called, it's in their sacred Bible called the Popol Vuh. And the Popol Vuh is actually found hidden in a Catholic church altar in Guatemala.
Yeah.
So it's really interesting, that story there. So as I went through these... I'm sorry?
Let me back up there a little bit, because I want to ask you about this. What about... I've always pondered if the Vatican sponsored journeys that went over to South America with the, Pizarro, the conquistadors, the people who wanted to, get over there, how much of the knowledge at that time actually was exported, if you will, from South America over to the Vatican, and at that point they begin to pick up on this. They begin to make basically it's like reigniting their own science in a way. That's a way I've always looked at it, but I haven't found somewhat circumstantial evidence for us. But do you think that could be something that was going on at the time? Since you said they lost it, but then when they went over there, they actually managed to tap into those records again, if you will. What do you think?
I think they did somewhat. I don't know to what extent, because nobody really knows. A lot of that information has been lost. But it seems like on the surface that they had discovered that the Mayans knew about this area of the cosmos, and they made an attempt to hide it from people, is what it seems like.
Yeah.
There's a lot of mysterious information around all this stuff. For example, no telescopes were invented until 1611, but the creation of Adam, which was painted by Michelangelo, was created in 1511, which was 100 years before the telescope was invented. And the level of detail that was used to emulate or copy the Orion Nebula it can only be seen from something with a high-powered telescope, almost something like the Hubble, or something like a very high-powered amateur telescope. And so that raises a lot of interesting questions about how did they know how to paint this kind of stuff, but they did. See. And they did it to such a level of detail that was one of the major areas I started to explore, because I was, your left brain wants to say, well, they didn't have telescopes back then, there's no way they could have done that, but yet the information is right there in front of your face, and I believe that Carl Jung has a very good idea of what happened. But just to kind of let you know, that very center of the Orion Nebula called the trapezium, that bright area, I had that burned into my head from seeing it so many times in these cathedrals. In fact, it's all over the place in art and cathedrals with all these artists. And so when I went to Egypt and I had backed out on Google Earth, looking at the Nile and the Nile Delta, I found the exact same pattern. And it's the Nile Delta. And the Nile Delta itself, that area at the very top of the Nile that's shaped like a triangle, is the same as the trapezium. And it gets into even more mysterious stuff here, because when you take a look at the patterns, the images actually match even man-made recent development. Now,
give us a few examples.
Well, there's some areas along the mouth of the Nile where the Nile actually goes right into the Nile Delta. There are some grid structures that have very specific shapes around the outside of that delta. And the very same shapes are inside around the bottom part of the trapezium as well. Now, the reason that this is significant is because it's not a natural fractal. We all say, okay, well, the leaf looks like the tree. It's a smaller version of the tree. Mm-hmm. But these are man-made.
So they're filling in the blanks. We've seen this before, actually, in other situations where it's like man almost perhaps unconsciously comes in there to correct the not the mistake from nature, but the fact that it wasn't completed in the greater image that it was intended to be created as.
Well, I mean, I have looked at, I've looked at all kinds of ancient texts. I've read the pyramid texts. I've read the Book of the Dead or the Book of Coming Forth by Day. I've read all of the doctrines by Hermes Trismegistus. I mean, I have gone all over the place. And what I do find that there is definitely this focus on this area of the sky. And even if you take a look at Robert Bauval's Orion correlation, what we see is the three pyramids that match the belt stars. If we take a look, say, an example, on Stellarium at 10,500 BC, and we look at Orion in the sky mirroring the belt stars, well, exactly where the Orion Nebula would be, according to where the pyramids are mirrored, would be where the Nile Delta is. But more specifically, we see that what they were using those pyramids for in this particular function could have been a marker, because if we look at it proportionally, obviously, the pyramids wouldn't even be on the map. I think that the pyramids were used as a marker to show something larger, which was the Nile Delta, which happens to be this primordial image that keeps coming out in art over the centuries.
So let's try to figure out what this is, what Orion is, the whole nebula altogether. There's, as you've explained already, a lot of different components to it. We have a constellation in there. We have different geometrical shapes and everything else. But it seems to be described both in tradition and some of the new findings that you've made the correlation between as some kind of source point, I guess we could say. This is where the Spirit of God emanates from. Tell us a little bit more about this.
Well, I've done a little bit of looking into, the ancient Egyptians saw Orion in general as Osiris. And when the pharaohs, when they died, they believed that their souls actually went to Orion to become a star. And we see the king's chamber, the so-called king's chamber, the shaft of that pointing to Orion. And I believe, of course, if you have a soul that's going to come to Orion to become a star, well, the most logical place to become a star would be where stars are born, and that would be inside the Orion Nebula. So there appears to be some kind of a connection there. The Orion Nebula is very interesting in that it's extremely holographic. I don't know if you've looked at full version copies of it, but it's not like any other nebula that you may have seen. It's extremely holographic, and it shows very symbolic things. Now, one of the things that R.A. Schwaller de Lubix goes into in his document about ancient Egypt and symbolism and things like that is that the ancient Egyptians looked at all nature as symbolic writing, from the physical all the way to the spiritual. They looked at nature and they could read nature as symbolic writing. And this appears to be what the Orion Nebula is doing. But there is this mirror of, if you're familiar with what the term anthropos is, which is primordial man.
Yep, the mix between man and animal, pretty much.
Right. It's kind of like a primordial man where, and in fact in Kabbalah, what it describes as the anthropos would be more like a world soul. It would be like everybody's souls combined existing in that area. Even Hermes said that. He said, Egypt is the image of heaven. When we look into the Orion Nebula, what we see that it is an image of Egypt. Really, for real. And he also said that Egypt was the temple of the world, and we understood that the Egyptians realized that the temple also was an understanding of the human body, both physically and metaphysically. And so when we look to some of the art and some of the clues that have been providing to us, what we see as far as what's on Earth is from the Nile and the Nile Delta, is we see that it kind of mimics the human nervous system. If you've ever taken a look at the Nile and the Nile Delta, it actually has the curvature of the spinal cord, where the top of it, where the Nile Delta is the area where the brain would be. And this is kind of where we gets into what is the Orion Nebula and what is it showing us. We've already seen Michelangelo show us that it's a brain. And so when we look at the paintings from El Greco, El Greco has painted the Nile, and what he did at the very top of the Nile, and this is called Mount Sinai, which was the place where Moses apparently went to talk to God. But what he painted is he painted the Nile, and he painted a brain sitting inside of the Nile Delta, which was very significant, and that pointed a clue to me because I realized what the Egyptians were trying to show. These great pyramids, where the pyramids are placed, if we take a look at the Nile and the Nile Delta as an understanding of the human nervous system, then the pyramids, where they are, is the same place as where the pyramids of the brain are. And that is right where the spinal cord goes into the base of the skull, right where the medulla oblongata is. And so the pyramids just so happen to be placed right there where the pyramids of the brains are. Now, the pyramids of the brain is where your signals start crossing. You know, your right arm is worked by the left side of your brain, and your left arm is your right side of your brain. Interestingly, the Nile itself stays solid, but right when it gets to where the pyramids are, which is called the decussation of the pyramids, the Nile starts crossing back and forth, and then it splits up into two areas, going all the way up to the top of the Nile Delta, and this mimics the nervous system as well.
Wow, interesting.
So it appears that the Nile Delta is this area representing the brain, and in more of my recent discoveries, as I have been digging into the Orion Nebula, I have found that all of the parts, including the trapezium area, and the ventricles and the corpus callosum and the pons and all of these parts of the brain are found inside of the Orion Nebula. The trapezium area, which is the brightest area, seems to correspond to the pineal gland. And this is significant because we find it all across these cultures. So this goes into some very deep study, but we see this kind of thing over and over. Now, just to back up some of the stuff that I've found, in November of 2011, based on cathedral art, I saw over and over that this bright spot that was in the middle, these angels circling around this bright spot, and I had already labeled this as the Orion Nebula. So I went out to find out what they were depicting there, and I discovered this vortex that was in the very center of the Orion Nebula where the trapezium is. There's this obvious vortex that's sitting right in the center of it. And I put out videos about that in November of 2011. Well, interestingly, November of 2012, NASA put out information that they believe that there'd be a black hole in the center of the Orion Nebula where the trapezium is. Mm-hmm. So they pretty much confirmed what I had already found a year ago based on cathedral art.
Very interesting. I want to go back a little bit more to the body connection to Egypt and everything else. The famous images of the Eye of Ra, Eye of Horus, whatever name you want to put on it, and the correlation to the brain as well, with the top part of the eye. Above the eye, we have the corpus callosum. If you do, there are images and sketches of this online. Of course, it's a cut through, if you will, of the brain, and a two-dimensional representation of that is basically the Eye of Horus, and you have the corpus callosum, the thalamus, the hypothalamus, the medulla oblongata, all these parts in there. And the question is, and as you said as well, of Schwaller de Lubitsch, the Temple of Man. At Luxor, same thing. Is this, in your view, Danny, evidence that they had knowledge of the brain, they were doing brain surgery, they had looked at this stuff, or how did they know this? How did they get to this information, do you think?
Well, I can't. I definitely know that they had information about the human body. R.A. Schwaller de Lubitsch was able to determine that from the Temple of Man and the various hieroglyphics that were found in the various stages of this in the Temple of Man. And he took a look at the proportions using phi and stuff like that, and as well as the hieroglyphics themselves, and determined that. And he also determined that the area that when people walked into the temples and left the temples, that they were walking into an area that represented the central pineal gland. This was the holiest of holies to them. And so, if we go with what R.A. Schwaller de Lubitsch understood about the ancient Egyptians, then it would be fair to say that what they had done was found out through looking into nature one way or another, perhaps not the Orion Nebula, but perhaps something that maybe clued them into this area, because this obviously is something we're trying to bring back after thousands of years. But if we do the same kind of thing that the ancient Egyptians did, I was able to extract from the Orion Nebula that the trapezium is a part of the body, and that's very important, and then it corresponds to the pineal gland. So I was able, and then it corresponds to a vortex. And I was able to do that by looking at this nebula. And so I'm guessing that the ancient Egyptians must have done something similar. Maybe not perhaps looking at the Orion Nebula. Perhaps they used the Nile and the Nile Delta, or perhaps they used something around Egypt to do that, because we do hear Hermes saying that Egypt is the temple of the world and it's the image of heaven. So understanding that, they must have used nature somehow to determine these parts of the body and their significance.
And again, I want to go back to the idea of how we explain this. There's a few different possibilities. As far as I know, as you said then, Danny, the Orion Nebula is something that you can't see with the naked eye. Obviously, you can see the stars of the constellation in the Orion constellation, but if we want to try to explain it, there's a few different possibilities, and I'm going to want to get your take on this. I mean, either we're looking at ancient technology, and they can be very, very old. This could literally be a telescope, maybe even more advanced than that. Something happened, major catastrophe. We're smacked back into a kind of a prehistoric state, and we have to do it all over again. And then eventually we develop technology, develop telescopes, and then it's now at this point again where we can kind of confirm, if you will, the imagery. That's one take on it. Another one is that someone has given the knowledge to some of us humans in the past, or it's completely subconscious. The muse, if you will, of these artists have given the imagery to them for some reason, because this, there's a drive here, something important with it, and we're simply tapping into the importance of it. Or maybe the fourth option would be that in the past, people actually went on hallucinogenic trips, and they actually visited, if you will, the area in spirit, if nothing else, and managed to see how it looks pretty much, and thereby being able to pull it out. What do you think when you're looking at all this stuff, Denny?
Well, based on the evidence that I have found, I would probably go with the last two that you just mentioned there. I would probably go with that it was either a subconscious thing, or that they used plants. Like, we know that the ancient Egyptians used the blue lily, I believe, and there were some hallucinogenics. I know that the acacia tree over there as well is also hallucinogenic, but that's definitely a possibility, that they were able to reach higher states or altered states of consciousness in order to be able to find out information about this area. But when we look into the art that we find over the centuries, there seems to be something that now, unless every one of these artists used hallucinogens, which I don't believe that they did, right? They could have. But what we find is that the accuracy of the painting, to me, even if they had used hallucinogenics, they still would have had to have pulled that out or dumped it out onto the canvas based on what they had seen during their hallucinogenic experience. And so what we find is that what they dump onto the canvas is so accurate that I don't believe that it could have been pulled from memory that way. It's almost down to to a level of accuracy that's the same as what we're seeing out there, and that would have had to have been pulled from memory in their hallucinogenic experience. Either that, or they were doing it while they were painting, which I doubt. So that to me leaves more of a subconscious nature as far as the art that's being dumped out on the canvas. Now, I think that these artists painted this stuff, and I don't think that they knew what they were painting when they painted it. And I think in some ways it kind of came back as karma to the church in some ways. I don't think that they knew. I think when they found out what the Orion Nebula looked at, then I think they went, oh, wow, this looks just like Michelangelo's painting. I think maybe we, should hide that Popol Vuh possibly. But here's the deal. So I think that it's a combination of hallucinogens that maybe the ancient Egyptians used, And I think it's definitely this these primordial images that Carl Jung mentions that comes out subconsciously in art. I mean, that's specifically the way that he describes these archetypal images that come out. And this is what we see over and over again. And so I think there's this combination of the two coming out there. The ancient Egyptians obviously applied knowledge to this information.
Yeah.
So that means that beyond the subconscious, they were actually able to take that information and apply some kind of knowledge to it. I don't think that it has something to do with telescopes or ancient technology. That's my own take. It could have been something that had been passed from people to people, but that still doesn't account for what we see in art over and over across the centuries.
I want to ask you about this. If we look at the depictions, we see that the concept of Yahweh is centered around the brain, as you explained, and pretty much we can make it's a pretty easy correlation, but the ego is kind of identified with the brain a little bit. This is kind of consciousness of the archetypal force of the Old Testament God that kind of comes through, if you will. So if we have a lot of people at that time, specifically the artists and such, that are very dedicated to their God, to their religion, to their faith, they're constantly mulling upon this. They're thinking about it. They want to be in connection with God. They want to understand what it is. It's I can't help to think that in some way the depiction comes out because it's an association with what the energy actually is. So see if I can explain this. The Orion Nebula, then, if that is the brain, if you will, of the universe, if this is where things emanate from, then surely if you try to tap into that, that's the imagery that's gonna come to you. And so when you paint that, you make the association, let's say, between God and the brain, which is in this case on the bigger macro cosmic level, the Orion Nebula. Or how can we explain it, do you think? Or am I just kind of missing the point?
This is a very deep subject right here. When we look into Hermetic philosophy, for example, the universe is described as a mental creation. So I guess for a lot of people, an easier way to put that would be kind of like a matrix or a holographic type universe that's created by thought. And this is kind of what we see over and over again. I believe personally, if we try to apply the principle of correspondence to things, if the universe is a mental creation, then what we more than likely have are layers upon layers of that. So if the universe at the very top level creates something, then at a lower level, that lower level probably does the same thing, and so on and so on. I guess a physical way to, as an analogy to describe this, is we say we have a bunch of virtual servers that exist inside of a physical server. Those virtual servers are all creations of the physical server, but they all are the same part of it. And then you could just provide layers and layers of that. And just like when you go to sleep and dream at night, you are actually in a way creating a whole world inside your head until you wake up. And if that is happening in layers upon layers in the universe, then it's very possible that one layer up, where the Anthropos is, where the Orion Nebula is, that it's creating our realities mentally, and so on and so on, and we're all a part of that, and it's actually itself a part of something larger and larger. These are all hypotheses and getting into an area that there's no telling what could be happening, but it appears on the surface as though there is something definitely mental happening. There seems to be almost this matrixy type effect, because we see these same patterns being emulated on the ground in geography that are matching this area. Now, even Walter Russell, for example, goes into, in The Secret of Light, he talks about nebula, and he talks about what they do. And he says that what they are is God's recording area. So they record everything that happens in these nebula. And based on some of the information that I've been finding, it seems that seems to be what's happening. However, then we see Hermes saying that Egypt is the image of heaven. Therefore, he said it's a projection of the order of things above.
Yeah.
And that tells me that what we're seeing down here is just a projection of the order of things up there, which means that we're living in a holographic universe. So there's all kinds of ways to look at this when we go across culture. Which one's the correct one? I don't know. I mean, this is kind of a new area of research, but the data is right there in front of our face. So I think it's definitely worth exploring more.
No, indeed, it's an ongoing process, as it were, and we're trying to figure out where the hell we are and what the bleep is going on here. Let's maybe we could talk about some of the, I guess, more direct examples, if you will, of imagery. We can do this in any way you want as well, Danny. I mean, you could literally either send us some plates or images, if you will, of a few examples that we can begin to just talk about a little bit, some that you think really stand out to you, just a couple examples to give people a hint of the similarities of some of the artistry, some of the paintings that we see on the ceilings of many cathedrals around Europe, and the correlation to Orion. Is that something that's doable, do you think, over the air?
Sure, definitely. The art is actually what's given me the most of my clues so far. And the neatest thing about it is that the art is always given me clues, and it's always guided me to a truth, to a greater truth every time. The interesting thing about each one of these pieces of art is they all provide their own little clues. For example, Michelangelo, he painted the creation of Adam, and he showed us that it was a brain, so he gave me this connection to see that this had something to do with the human body, it had something to do with the brain, and just the placement of where he put things. For example, he put the trapezium right in God's chest, and the trapezium there seems to be this connection to heart there. The heart of God is what first comes to mind when you see that. But we also see that there's a connection to that and the pineal gland. So he gave us this interesting connection to the human body and what he was representing as God. Now, he did another painting in 1542, and this other one is very interesting, and it kind of confirms this relationship of the Orion Nebula to resurrection. What he painted was the conversion of Saul, and if anybody is familiar with that biblical story, there was this guy named Saul on his way to Damascus, and apparently he was going to persecute these Christians, and apparently he heard this voice from Jesus saying, "Why are you persecuting? Why are you persecuting everyone, Saul?" And he was hit by this blinding light from Jesus, apparently, and it blinded him for 3 days. 3 days is a very interesting number. We see 3 days repeated over and over, and it has something to do with resurrection. Well, the interesting thing about what Michelangelo painted in 1542 was he painted this picture of God floating in the Orion Nebula trapezium, zapping Saul with this light. Now, that's significant because we hear all the time about these various stars, supernova, and astrotheology and stuff like that, sending light, causing things to happen here on the planet, changing us consciously.
Yeah.
And we see that the resurrection seems to be tied to this particular area by the Mayans. It's also tied to this area from the ancient Egyptians and Osiris, because Osiris is also a resurrection god. And so we see now that the Orion Nebula in Michelangelo's art, God is floating in the trapezium, hitting Saul and blinding him with light. And then apparently this was some form of a spiritual resurrection that occurred in Saul, and maybe this area of the cosmos seemed to be some kind of the causing factor of that. Not really sure, but that's what it seems to be pointing to.
And this is, by the way, you have that linked up, if you will, in your book, or referenced under the NCBI, the .gov website, where they talk about basically more or less accepted that this image contains these last 4 panels of the creation of Adam represent some kind of conceal. They write conceal another neuroatomic structure in the final panel of the series. That this is some kind of sophisticated knowledge about this between the brain and this image of God. So it's not only what should we say? It's also even now at this point officially quote unquote recognized, right?
Yeah, there was another fresco that he did in the floor. It was called The Separation of Light and Dark. And these guys who were neurologists noticed that he had painted the brain stem inside the throat of God, and it was supposed to represent moving from this the brain stem area, or the reptilian complex, or the R complex, into the higher portions of the of consciousness, which are inside the brain. And so, yeah, it's really interesting. And so these neurologists apparently agree that he did paint the brain. Of course, what they get backwards, and one of the ways we can tie this to the Orion Nebula is on this particular brain that he painted. Is this what looks like a knot on one side, on the outside of the on this little cloud that God is in. And, of course, on any brain, you don't see that knot, but, of course, you see it on the Orion Nebula. And, of course, the woman is the woman that God has his arm around is extremely visible in the Orion Nebula down to all its details. But, there's this area, and this trapezium area, okay, that we see over and over in these paintings. We always see Jesus ascending or standing upon this trapezium. So what happens is for one of the good ones is the Triumph of the Franciscan Order, which is an obvious imitation of the Orion Nebula trapezium. What we see is that as we transition it from the painting to the Orion Nebula, that Jesus is standing right in the center of this trapezium area. But when we see that out in the Orion Nebula, we realize that area is where two things are, the pineal gland and a vortex. And see, when we look into biblical stuff, we also see that, for example, Elijah was taken to heaven in a whirlwind. Right? And there's a painting of him actually where it shows him rising up into the trapezium area. And when we transition it from the painting to the Orion Nebula, he is actually sitting on top of that vortex, exactly where the vortex is. It's these kind of subconscious clues that we continue to get over and over in these various paintings. And the focus area apparently seems to be the trapezium at the very, very center of this area.
Yeah, you've done a good job in the book, of course, of showing the transition, if you will, from the original Orion image and then transitioning slowly between the painting and then finally just the painting at the end. And there's some stunning similarities here, for sure. It's really interesting. Do you think as well, if we backtrack slightly, that, again, the tradition from the Roman Catholic Church has their origins in a older astro-theological tradition, and therefore they have been, very interested in, keeping this tradition, maybe esoterically hidden, if you will, occult, and also this is the fact that they've actually carried on the tradition at all. What do you think, Danny?
I think when we look into history, and this is a little bit of a touchy subject for some people, but when we look into history and we start looking across culture, and if anybody's familiar with Manly P. Hall and some of the others that have done research into this area, we see that they most definitely have taken information from ancient Egypt and the story of Osiris, as well as Mithra, which was going on at the same time. But there's definitely the parallels that we see of the resurrection among all of these gods. What I believe the Catholic Church has actually done is they have changed the meaning of what resurrection is from a physical death. I mean, from a spiritual death or an ego death to something physical, and then they placed an idol of worship in there, and so in a way, what they have done is twisted it to where instead of it becoming something where you're supposed to better yourself over time, which is what the real teachings I believe were supposed to be about. It's about, for example, when Jesus was crucified, he was crucified in a place called Golgotha. When we look into what that means in Aramaic, it means the place of the skull.
Skull, yeah. And
that gives us some insight into what was really meant by that. The crucifixion actually happened inside a person's head. And we look at the story of Osiris back in ancient Egypt, he was also a resurrection god and came back as Horus. These different gods were different representations, in my opinion, of these personalities that came about so Horus was a resurrected version of Osiris. And we see this kind of thing over and over again across culture, but what's happened is, I believe, that the Roman Catholic Church has inserted things such as fear and holding hell and things like that over people's head, and the constant don't look at this, don't look at that, it's evil, and what that has done is it's kept people half-conscious, because they're not allowed to go out and look at other things and say, well, look, this looks very similar to what I've read here. They don't want people to do that, because if they do that, then they start seeing the parallels, and they start putting the pieces together. And I think that's what's happening. And so I think they've twisted it into this idol of worship. So the idea of worshiping Jesus, really, in my opinion, means worshiping higher consciousness. It means obtaining higher levels of consciousness. And I think that's what they have done, is they've twisted it into this idol of worship where just believe in something and just leave it at that and everything will be okay. Don't worry about bettering yourself or raising your consciousness at all. Just believe in something and then everything will be fine. And I disagree with that, and it doesn't seem to appear to agree with the parallels across culture.
Yeah, I agree. And they've also very instrumentally tried to keep people behind the curtain, if you will, stupid, quote unquote, because this higher knowledge that they speak of seems to be something that they want to keep to themselves. I also think that there's tremendous amounts of power, if you will, in understanding these esoteric principles in the universe of how things really work, how they really tick, where the source, where the emanation is from. Even though they might be, quote unquote, theoretical at this point, they're important, ideas, I think. And if you keep people away from that, you are not going to grow into some of the other areas that comes with that, a greater understanding and so forth. So it's been a way for them, I think, to kind of get their hands around this knowledge, and then on the outside try to deny it, as you said. Don't look at this; it's evil. Just whatever, stay away from it. But then keep it to themselves, basically, so that the rest could be subjugated and controlled, pretty much.
Yeah, and if we take a look at the history of the Bible, for example, the Catholic Church and their canon laws are what decided which books of the Bible went into it and which ones were left out. All that was based on who they considered to be inspired and who they considered to be, part or hearing things from the Holy Spirit. And so what they did was they did two things. They decided what went into the Bible and what was left out, and they also decided how it was interpreted. So and you can check that. But there are tons of, including the Corpus Hermeticum, and it was found in Egypt, along with I guess it was in Nag Hammadi Library. Mm-hmm. All of these things. There's so much great information out there that's part of early Christian writings, but yet is said by the Roman Catholic Church, who actually brought us the Bible. See, they took over the Old Testament, I believe it was in somewhere around 100 A.D. from the Jews, and then I believe they didn't publish the New Testament until 380 A.D. Right around the time of Emperor Constantine, when he converted to Christianity. So there seems to be some kind of a political movement that happened a long time ago. But of course, we didn't get the Bible until 1611 from the King James Version. Now, here's the interesting thing about it. See, this is where words get in the way. There are probably 100 different Bibles out there.
Oh, sure. More,
yeah. And they all have slightly different verbiage. But here's a prime example of how the words get confused, because, for example, the word Lucifer is found in the King James Bible. And the way it's described, is how have you fallen from the sky, Lucifer, son of the morning. I can't remember exactly how it goes, but they now what you hear is that people talk about that being Satan, but yet Lucifer is only mentioned in one place in the Bible, and it's never mentioned as being Satan. This was something that was made up and interpreted a different way. And when you go out and you take a look at the various other interpretations of the Bible, in most of those you don't see the word Lucifer. You see morning star. Lucifer is a Latin Vulgate for day star, which means it's basically the morning star. But yet, what happens in these whole interpretations that the church has done, and from people misunderstanding things and not being allowed to look across culture, is that that words get in the way of understanding these visions, because these were all visions to begin with. They weren't. The universe does not communicate in words. It communicates in pictures and images and things like that. When we dream, we don't dream of words. But you can see how all of the interpretation gets screwed up, and that's what the church has done, is they didn't rewrite anything, but they had the advantage to be able to interpret it in the first place. And then they tell everybody, this is exactly what it means, and if you don't believe me, you're going to go to hell. And,
yeah, that's right. Now, Danny, we're going to take a break in a little bit here, but of course, we want to talk about your details and how people can, kind of look into your stuff, get the book, etc. But before we do that, one more point I want to run by you here, and that's actually quite timely since you talked about Lucifer. And I didn't want to talk about the interest, if you will, from the Vatican's point of view in research in astronomy, stars and the Milky Way, faraway galaxies, etc. Because some people might think that they're not really. I mean, first of all, they're definitely into astrology, but they're also into astronomy. And so and I've brought up this example before in another couple of shows, but I'll wing it by you again in case someone hasn't heard it. It's from an article here we posted in 2010 in April. It says, the Vatican Observatory Research Group, VORG, operates the 1.8 million Alice P. Lennon telescope with its Thomas J. Bannon Astrophysics Facility, known together as the Vatican Advanced Technology Telescope, the VATT, at the Mount Graham International Observatory in southeastern Arizona, where sky conditions are among the best in the world and certainly in the continental United States. What's funny about this, though, is that this new instrument that they've installed here is called the Large Binocular Telescope Near Infrared Utility with Camera and Integral Field Unity for Extragalactic Research. And the Vatican has shortened... Yeah, the Vatican, hang on to this one, though. The Vatican also shortened it, the abbreviation, to Lucifer for this telescope.
Yeah, I'm familiar with that.
Yeah,
Isn't that funny?
Yeah, it's amazing.
Well, what that tells us then is that they understand that Lucifer is not Satan either, or they would never name their telescope Lucifer.
No, of course not. So,
I think it's, I'm very familiar with, I don't know if you know, but the Vatican is also very kind of in NASA's business, and they own a lot of the telescopes, and even Nassim Haramein goes into this, that look at the sun and things like that. The Vatican has large interests in all of this.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, they know what's going on. They know what the source for their own religion really is. But we'll carry on, talk more about this, Danny, in the second hour. This is fascinating. Let's talk about your book, how people can get it. Let's talk about your websites, give out your YouTube channels, whatever you want to mention there, so people know where to go to find out more from you.
Yeah, orionandthevatican.com, and I have a PDF ebook. It's priced at $10, so it's nothing really. The whole purpose of it was to get it in as many hands as possible. But if you go to orionandthevatican.com, you can get the ebook there. It's a PDF version for $10. You can also find me on Facebook at Danny Wilten, and that's Wilten. Or you can find me on YouTube at you just type in the same name, Danny Wilten. You'll find me on YouTube as well if you do a search.
All right, very good. OrionInTheVatican.com website. We'll have it linked up on RedIceCreations.com. We'll carry on more now with the second hour with Danny, so stay with us, everybody. We'll be right back. More is coming up in the second hour. We discuss symbols as the winged disc, the red dragon, and the all-seeing eye. Danny will talk about the Orion constellation and Pleiades, as mentioned in the Bible. Later we discuss Ellen G. White, who founded the Seventh-day Adventist Church, as well as other seers and visionaries who have been mentioning Orion in their work. Wilten further explains why the findings he's made can't be explained away as pareidolia, seeing patterns in random data. Much more is coming up. And as a member, you can tune into this next hour or any of our previous programs that we do have archived on redicemembers.com. Just click on subscribe to read more about our different subscription options. And by the way, we have Robert Tyndall, and then Russell Targ, Lynn Picknett, and many more coming up on the program next. You're, of course, welcome to tune in again whenever it works for you. You can download or stream any of our programs when it suits you. All right, thanks for staying with us, guys. We'll talk to you more after this break.